Hi guys, welcome to another Flight Deck 2 Sim tutorial. In today's video we're going to look at winter operations, more specifically the de-icing and anti-icing procedure, but also how to set up and prepare the aircraft prior to departure. We'll also look at a taxi and takeoff as well. Now, to make this as realistic as possible, we'll simulate a flight from London, Luton to Marseille in the south of France, and if you look outside you can see there's some pretty inclement weather. There's a light westerly wind, temperatures -2 degrees Celsius, there's some light snow showers around, and the visibility is around 2,000 metres. Now, we're currently operating in freezing conditions. Now, freezing conditions is defined as whenever the temperature is below 3 degrees Celsius, with any signs of visible moisture, fog, or whenever the visibility is less than 1 statute mile. It also includes any forms of precipitation and any sign of ice, snow, slush or standing water on the ramp, taxiway and runway. And when freezing conditions are in force, we need to operate the aircraft a little bit differently. Now, we need to ensure that prior to takeoff that the aircraft is completely free of any snow, ice and contamination. The upper surface of the wing and horizontal stabilizer and leading edge devices must be free of ice and snow. And to remove that, we need to de-ice the aircraft and then anti-ice it to prevent any further build-up of contamination. Now, I won't go into too much detail about this procedure because you can find the information online, but today we're going to do a two-step procedure. The first step is to remove the contamination, which is the de-icing procedure, and then the second step is the anti-ice procedure to prevent further contamination from building up on the aircraft. Now, in reality, we choose 4 different types of fluid. There's type 1, type 2 and type 3 and type 4, and essentially the number that's the lowest of the fluids have the shorter holdover times. Now, you might be asking, what is a holdover time? Well, it's the amount of time that we need to make sure that we're airborne by after the beginning of the application of the anti-icing fluid. Now, we'll just say we're going to use type 2 today, and after the application of the fluid we would check something called the holdover time, and that would tell us how long we need to be airborne by. And here's an example of a generic holdover time for a type 2 fluid. You can see, using the current external weather conditions, the temperature is -2 degrees Celsius, it's currently snowing, and let's say we used a glycol water mixture of 75-25, well, you can see the holdover time in this case is between 15 and 25 minutes. We must ensure we're airborne by this time. Now, the aircraft is fully set up and ready for departure. You essentially do the same setup as you would do normally. The only difference is that you turn the probe heat on during the setup, which you'd usually do in my company during the before taxi checklist, but they're already on. That's to obviously prevent any snow or ice buildup on the probes. Now, I've just installed GSX recently, so let's now look at the de-icing procedure. Now we're ready for the de-icing and anti-icing checklist prior to engine start. We just need to configure the aircraft accordingly. So we'd read the winter operations checklist, and all it simply says is APU off unless needed. Well, the ground crew will have already disconnected the ground power realistically, and after the de-icing and anti-icing procedure we're going to go straight to the pushback. So in this case it is needed. Now, we try and turn it off if possible to avoid any objectionable fumes entering the cabin, because if that mixes with the air conditioning system it can cause some negative side effects. However, to prevent that from happening, what we're going to do is turn the APU bleed air switch off in this case to prevent that from happening. All we then verify is that the stab trim is set for takeoff, which it is. It's about 5.5 units, and the flaps are selected up and they're indicating up, and that prevents the de-icing and anti-icing fluid from entering any of the flap cavities. All we need to now do is talk to the ground crew and start the de-icing and anti-icing treatment. Now the aircraft's been de-iced and anti-iced, all we now need to do is reconfigure the aircraft ready for the pushback and start clearance. We used to have to wait 1 minute until after the de-icing or anti-icing treatment to help prevent any of those objectionable fumes entering the cabin and flight deck. And all it simply says is to make sure the APU, if it was off, you can now start. APU bleed air switch as needed. Well, we need it on to make sure that we can start the engines, and then the before start checklist, if not done so already, we would accomplish. And the before start checklist is the exact same one as we would use in normal operations. Now that checklist is complete. We're now fully ready for the push and start clearance. Now to get the push and start clearance, all we do is contact Luton ground. We'd confirm our parking stand. In this case, we're on stand 41, request push and start. And in this case, they probably get us to face east to taxi out via Delta onto the Alpha taxiways to holding point Alpha 1 for runway 26, which is the runway we're going to be departing today. Now we've got the clearance, so all we need to simply do is go into the overhead panel, packs off for the engine start, verify the isolation valve is open and the APU bleed is on, anti-collision light can go on, might as well put the wheel well off, parking brake is set, and then the transponder goes to out off, and we're now fully ready for the push and start.
Hello, Captain. We are ready for pushback. Commencing push. Due to icing conditions, please stand by for engine start until push completed and brakes set. Set parking brakes.
Okay, so the pushback is now complete. I forgot to mention we've just delayed the engine start. Now, this is the procedure at certain airports, especially if there's a lot of snow and contamination on the taxiway, to prevent any residual thrust from moving the aircraft. So we'll just let the ground crew remove the bypass pin, and we'll wait until they're clear of the aircraft to commence the engine start. Alright guys, I'm just in the process of starting the engines for our flight. The ground crew's already buggered off and left me. In reality, they would stay with the aircraft until both engines have been started, but with the reality of a desktop simulator and GSX, the ground crew's already off. But hopefully we won't have any issues and the engines would start normally. Now the engine start procedure is identical as it would be for normal operations. In very cold conditions it can be a little bit more difficult to start the engines. Sometimes you might put the igniters to both to aid with the engine start, but all that guidance you can find in the supplementary procedures of FCOM 2. Looks like we've got N2 rotation, EGT is increasing nicely, so it looks like so far we have a normal engine start. There's start switch to off, and then monitoring the engines, got N1 EGT, N2 fuel flow, start lever confirms idle detent, and that's 2 good engine starts. Now normally we would do the before taxi checklist, but obviously we're in freezing conditions. This procedure is ever so slightly different. It's very similar, but the only difference is we need to cycle the flaps from up to 40 and up, carefully monitoring the indications. So we'll start the flow now. This would be completed by the pilot flying for the sector. So generators go on, APU is not required, so that can go off. Start switch is in continuous. Probe heat, verify it's on. Now the engine anti-ice is required, so we can put the engine anti-ice is on, verify the cowl valve lights are in open. Now you might be asking, why am I not putting the wing anti-ice on? Well, if we've been de-iced or anti-iced by type 2 or type 4 fluid, we don't actually use wing anti-ice because we're protected by the fluid prior to takeoff. Otherwise, if the temperature was below 10 degrees Celsius and we had visible moisture and any signs of rain, sleet or snow, we would use wing anti-ice, but it isn't required today. Air conditioning packs go to auto, isolation valve to auto, APU bleed air switch to off. Now this is what we have to do with the flaps. We have to cycle them all the way from up to 40, and we need to carefully monitor the trailing edge flap indication for any asymmetry, any split or any problems. Now the flaps are in 40, all we need to simply do is to select the flaps to up, and again carefully monitoring the indications. Now if the wing was contaminated with large deposits of ice or snow, we would delay cycling the flaps after any remote de-icing. Certain airports they have de-icing away from stand, but from what I understand we can't simulate that with GSX, so we had to do the on-stand de-icing, which is probably the most common of the two types. So again, carefully monitoring the flaps for any split between the trailing edge needles, any asymmetry indication. And what we do then, we actually taxi out with the flaps up, which is a bit of a threat because we don't want to end up taking off with the flaps in the up position. Now the flaps are up, we just verify that we have the correct stab trim takeoff setting, so 5.5 units are set. The start levers are idle detent. We'll then check the flight controls, so just move my joystick over here. Full forward, full aft, full left, centre and full right centre, and then checking the rudders, full left centre, full right centre. Last thing we need to do is the recall, and then we would call for the before taxi checklist in freezing conditions, but we'll imagine that's been completed, and we'd obviously check that the aircraft's correctly configured. Now we have two different things to do now. In this case we've already been de-iced, so what we need to do, we need to taxi to the holding point with the flaps up to prevent any contamination from getting in the flaps. If we were forecasting remote de-icing, we'd then taxi to the de-icing pan, but I might leave that out for another tutorial. So in this instance here, we would simply request taxi, and let's imagine that we've been told to taxi via Echo Delta to holding point Alpha 1 for runway 26. Okay, so added the thrust to start the taxi, and you might have noticed on my other tutorials I usually do something called a config check to see if the takeoff configuration warning horn sounds. Now obviously it would do because the flaps are up, so we delay the takeoff configuration warning horn test until we have the flaps extended. And what we're going to do, we're going to extend the flaps at the holding point Alpha 1 for runway 26. All we're going to do is taxi to this point, to the holding point. Okay, so we're now at holding point Alpha 1 for runway 26, and we don't expect any further delay for takeoff, so we'd now complete the before taxi checklist in freezing conditions. And all we'd now do, as we're at the holding point, is to select the flaps to 5. Once that's set, we release the parking brake, we do a quick config check, reset the parking brake, and then we complete the before takeoff checklist. Now it goes without saying, in reality, we'd also check that we haven't exceeded the holdover time. If we had exceeded the holdover time, we'd need to have the wings inspected prior to takeoff to ensure that it was still clear of any contamination, and if there was any signs of contamination, we would then have to get de-iced and anti-iced again. So now the flaps are at 5, we can release the parking brake, do a quick config check, there we go, and then we can reset the parking brake. The takeoff configuration warning horn didn't sound, so we know we're correctly configured for takeoff, and it now complete the before takeoff checklist, and we'll complete the one which is on the control column here, which is pretty much identical to the one in my company. So the before takeoff checklist, config was checked. Flaps, we have 5, green light. Stab trim, we just verify we got the correct takeoff setting, 5.6 units set. We then do a takeoff briefing, which is completed by the captain. He would say PAX auto, bleeds on, verify the V speeds for departure. So we have V1 of 136, VR of 138, and V2 of 147, which is set on the MCP. And looking at the departure, we're going to climb straight ahead to an altitude of 1,000 feet and then make a left turn 213 track inbound to Bovingdon, and we're going to climb to an altitude of 5,000 feet, which is set both in the MCP and the FMC, and that's essentially what a captain's takeoff briefing sounds like. We then verify the cabin is secure for departure, and then the winter operations before takeoff checklist is complete. We then contact Luton Tower, and we'll confirm that we're at holding point Alpha runway 26, fully ready for departure. We'll imagine we've been cleared for takeoff. We don't need to backtrack this runway today. We have sufficient performance, and the surface wind at the moment is 270 at 10 knots. So as we've been cleared for takeoff, we can put the retracts, fixed landing lights on. Oops, I forgot to turn on the turn off and taxi lights at the initiation of the taxi. Strobes go to steady, and auto throttle LNAV, captain will turn on the weather radar, and the transponder can go to TARA. Confirm with the first officer that we are cleared takeoff runway 26 via Alpha. He'd hopefully say A firm, I agree. Then checking that we're both clear left and clear right as best as we can see in these conditions. And now we can enter the runway, ready for the takeoff. Now there's only one thing that we need to do prior to takeoff when operating in winter operations, and it's quite a cool procedure. It's known as the engine fan blade icing removal. Now jet engines like this CFM are susceptible to fan blade icing if they've been operating for a long time in freezing conditions on the ground, and we need to shed that ice prior to taking off. So what we're going to do, we're going to stand the thrust levers up to 40%, call stabilize. We then increase the thrust to 70%, and we just hold the aircraft on the brakes, and Boeing recommend that you do this for 30 seconds. After the 30 seconds is up, we push toga and then commence the takeoff roll. And what that does, it just removes any contamination that could have been on the engine fan blades here. God, this aircraft is more difficult to line up than in real life. I think I might have overshot slightly here. Yeah, we'll get back on the centre line there. In reality, you can really turn this aircraft tightly. Cool, so get back onto the centre line. There we go, and the track is there. We're lined up nicely. Perfect, so now we're being cleared takeoff, and we completed the checklist. We put the timing on. Let's stand the thrust levers up to 40%. There we go, that looks like it's stabilised. Now we increase the thrust to 70%, and we just start a timer for 30 seconds, just holding on the foot brakes there. And what that should be doing is removing any cumulative build-up of fan blade icing to ensure that it's completely clear for the takeoff. Okay, coming up to 30 seconds now. Engine indications look normal, so we call stabilize, release the brake, push toga, set takeoff thrust. Light forward pressure on the control column, takeoff thrust set indications normal. Full 26k today, guys, because we took the Alpha intersection in Luton. There isn't that much runway available. 80 knots is checked. V1 and rotate 2 to 2.5 degrees per second, just maintaining the centre line with rudder, and we're airborne there onto the flight directors. So gear up, we have a positive rate, just following the flight directors accurately as we always want to do. Retracts and taxi light off. Whoops. Verify LNAV, and we're climbing very fast today. Command B will engage, so that's what a first officer would do. And now we're at 1,000 feet. We can bug up the aircraft as it's NADP2 departure. N1 thrust, climb thrust is engaged now, so reducing the takeoff thrust setting to climb thrust. We're increasing to the flap 1 speed, so we can select flap 1. Aircraft accelerating nicely. And now we can select flaps up. Currently inbound to the Bovingdon VOR on the 033 radial, so you can see it's tuned there, the green needles pointing to it very nicely. Good, now the flaps up, no lights. There's a low stop altitude, so we're going to go straight to vertical speeds, decrease that to 1,000 feet per minute. And we don't need to set standard because we're climbing to an altitude, and then we would complete the after takeoff checklist. Alright guys, the after takeoff checklist is complete, and that's the end of the winter operations tutorial regarding departure, takeoff and the de-icing and anti-icing profile. Now I tried to make that as realistic as possible within the confines of a desktop simulator. There were some slight omissions to what we do there in real life, but pretty much matched it as best as I could, and I hope you found that interesting and learned something new. Saw there the fan ice removal there. You can just do that to make the simulator more experienced. In reality, when we add that 40 to 70% thrust, we can sometimes expect some slight engine vibration during the run-up due to the shredding of the ice on the fan blades. That's normal. The vibration levels generally reduce, and then ensuring that we're stabilised at 70%, we push toga and take off. I've done it a few times in reality, and I've never really noticed any significant vibration. Anyway, I will do a couple more extra tutorials to explain the use of the engine and wing anti-ice. You can currently see we still have the engine anti-ice on for departure. That's because the temperature's below 10 degrees Celsius on the total air temperature probe. But again, I will do a dedicated tutorial to explain both wing and engine anti-ice. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to leave that in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Fly safe, and I'll see you again very soon.